Welcome, everybody. As you're probably aware, the last symposium we had was me looking at my kind of view of the Trump administration's kind of view on multilateralism, and maybe what was influencing the decision of the current president in terms of international trade. What I've asked Sean to do is like a counter position on that to really give us an idea about what is the thinking as well from the United States, what's driving this, what's happening in the US economy that's also having an influence on policy decisions. So a little bit about our speaker today, Dr. John Jasso. So he has an MBA from Pepperdine University, and he also has his PhD from the Peter Drucker School of Management at Claremont Graduate University in the United States. It's one of the top graduate universities in the US. He's consulted and taught widely on a range of issues, including international political economy. And I'm very pleased to welcome him coming all the way from China today, where I believe it's around about 8 p.m. with him. So he's over doing some consulting work in China. So Sean, over to you to talk on the US economy, or the state of the nation in 2025.
Good evening from China. Thought I'd talk to you about the United States, holding my Chinese money. Thought it'd be have a prop. I think Caesar's phone should be on mute because he's doing deals on the side. Good to be with you. I've met many of you before. You remember me. I don't have control of, well, maybe I do. I'm going to share a screen, and I'm going to give you a tour of what I think is the state of the nation, with a ton of slides, a ton of data that I think you'll really enjoy. It'll be enjoyable because it'll be, I think, insightful, instructive, and I'm quite certain maybe stuff that you really don't hear in the media. I'm not here to give you a discussion on Donald Trump. I'm not here to talk about any of that. I mean, we can later. Whatever you want to ask me, go right ahead. I am certainly not here to rip into the United States. I study the United States. I study a bunch of other things too, but I have I suppose you could say a purposeful talk to give you literally as unvarnished state of the nation, particularly with the numbers. All right, so let's get right into it. Stuart, I think we have 3 hours. Isn't that about right? But I think I can nail this thing in 45 minutes or less. Is that cool?
I was hoping you can.
All right, so hopefully we won't see anyone drop off. But again, thank you very much. It's good to be back with UBIS. Good to see some good friends. All right, so let's take a quick look. I'm going to give you some fresh insights. What I like about my cover slide is it's the state of the nation, and you see Africa and everywhere else. So that was my first little fun fact. All right, so my talk is going to address 4 things, 4 questions. Are we in a political economy? What are the numbers? What is the future? And what is the state of the nation? The common themes, we'll see taxing and spending and borrowing and innovating all kind of wrapped up into one analysis. So I have a question for, is it Azahar? Am I saying that right?
Just say Azza. One syllable is enough. Yeah.
All right, Azza. All right, who's this guy?
Adam Smith.
No, they all look like that, I think, right? They all have the same haircut.
Yeah.
We should ask Caesar. Caesar, who's this guy? Caesar's busy. All right, this guy is, I'm gonna ask one more. I'm wrong?
I think, yeah, he looks like too many different people.
This is actually John Adams.
Yeah.
Second president of the United States. That's when he lived, 1797 to 1801. Now, why am I showing you this picture? Well, I want to show you, he's the second president of the United States, and he is probably among the great founding fathers for being not just an intellect, but a real doer. And he's quite famous for writing love letters to his wife, Abigail. And I want to show you one of the most famous. If you looked up John Adams and said, give me a quote by John Adams, this would probably be something you'd see. So here's his letter. It's quite nice, 1780. He's in France, where he's representing the United States. 1789, by the way, is when the United States becomes the United States under the Constitution. And so to take a walk, this is to his wife, in the gardens of the Palace of Tuileries, and describe the statues. They're all in marble, in which the ancient divinities and heroes are represented, with a very pleasant amusement and instructive entertainment. improving in history, mythology, poetry, as well as statuary. Another walk in the garden of Versailles would be useful and agreeable, but to observe these objects with taste and describe them so as to be understood would require more time and thought than I can possibly spare. And then he goes on and he says the famous stuff. I could fill volumes with descriptions of temples and palaces, paintings, sculptures, tapestry, porcelain, etc., etc., if I could have time. But I could not do this without neglecting my duty. The science of government is my duty to study, more than all other sciences. And you can see where he crossed out and changed things. The art of legislation and administration and negotiation ought to take place, indeed, to exclude in a manner of all other arts. And this is his most famous quote: I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Now, I'm a person of the arts, the liberal arts. I studied English literature in the beginning while kind of doing my career in hotel management along the way to all this other stuff. And I've always thought of this as an important opportunity to understand, not just, I mean, we're talking about the United States, talking about American culture, American politics and economics. And here's this guy saying, look, we're creating a new nation so that our posterity can study English literature like me. So let's kind of begin. So part one, the policy arena, kind of a political economy. Again, I'm giving you a tour of the numbers. But let's first start with the black swan, the kind of elephant in the room on COVID. So you can see a quick snapshot during COVID. We have a huge hammering of unemployment in the various sectors. I put this up here because, number one, it's interesting to me from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but leisure and hospitality was where I spent a lot of my work life. I also consult in that area too. And what I'm showing you here is a hemorrhaging of employment, but also a trend in recovery. These are what the numbers look like then. You can see these huge spikes in unemployment. 14.8% is the peak in the American economy. This is like Great Depression stuff. This is the end of the world. And then recovery, or on the road to recovery. I'm going to show you, I mentioned a political economy. I'm going to show you what I've put together as the entire public policy response to COVID in one shot. Yeah, let me first show you this. This is the last day of the Johns Hopkins University reporting of COVID. Johns Hopkins in the United States and for much of the world was kind of the benchmark of the best and the real numbers as possible. So you have here the total cases in the world, red, and then the white down here is the US numbers. So 676 total, 676 million cases, 134 million cases in the US, total deaths, 6.8 million, many of them in the United States, 1.1 million. Vaccination dosage, 13 billion vaccines, 984 million in the United States. This is an interesting graph here. The bulk of the American population had at least one shot. Many of them had two. And you can see kind of the numbers that you might, or the images that you may recall. So this is the last day of the last measure of when that institution sort of stopped counting. Now here's the public policy snapshot in one slide. And I show you this because it's probably, I think this is quite unique. You see here when it all began. We have, and I want to show you the politics of this. So March 6, 2020, Congress says, oh, we need some focus on COVID. This is becoming problematic. And the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2020. What you might want to pay attention to is that we have 435 members in the House of Representatives, and 415 Democrats and Republicans voted for this. So it's quite unusual to have this kind of political support. And you can see that the Senate, which has 100 representatives, 96-1. And then it got worse. A few days later, the Congress began to come up with another program, healthcare access, tax credits, compliance incentives. And you can see that the the balance of the vote is pretty in favor. And then the big monster one, the CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And a lot of countries had similar policy issues. I know UK mirrored a lot of this as well. So initial unemployment relief, vaccine research and development initiates what's called the Payroll Protection Program or Paycheck Protection Program, and then literally giving direct money to people. 419 to 6, that's sort of unprecedented political support. And then, so that's the final one is the Paycheck Protection Program, ultimately with other loans. And you can see that at the end of the day, the initial response is the largest cost of any public policy initiative, more than World War II, more than anything in real numbers, at $2 trillion in allocated monies, support and so on. We have, and this is under one administration here, then we have a new administration, and you can see that this is more the American Rescue Plan Act, and you can see that the immediate bipartisan or the partisanship begins. Look at the vote here. 219 Democrats, yes, 212 Republicans, no. This is when you have 50-50 votes in the Senate. So it's extremely political. And at the end of the day, 4.1 trillion allocated toward COVID. If you have a question, just pop in. I might say I'll wait later, but if you want to just ask me anything, right ahead. So I continue, and I think this is a kind of a cool slide as well. I try to put the entire facts of everything into one slide, maybe even also, not maybe, to include also some theory and, you know, what explains this from a scholarly, political, economic perspective. We won't look at all of these things, but if you kind of take a look over the far right, by the way, Stuart, do you see my cursor moving around?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. All right, so if you look over here, you can see the political polarization right here, where you see Democrats and Republicans, just sort of nothing really in between. This is not a new phenomenon, but it just continues to grow in its partisanship. If we kind of come over here, I'm moving your faces all over the place so I can see. So we have what described this and what were the real numbers. So we had 800 billion in uncollateralized small business administration loans. What did that do? The evidence shows that it preserved 3 million job years. And if you look here, this is some interesting fun facts. Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, 30 billion to pharmaceutical firms, 1.2 billion doses, $20.69 per dose. A lot of people got their vaccine, quote, for free. This is the real cost to the government. The Federal Reserve, you can see that the rates were moved 10 times since March of 2022. We had quantitative easing, you may recall, from 2008 to 2012 in the amount of 4.5 trillion. This is in response to the crisis of 2008. And then yet we still have no remittances to the Treasury until 2027. The Treasury, for those of you not familiar with the Treasury, simply receives monies and taxes and pays the bills of the government. This is a kind of a cool little balance sheet. There's 5 trillion in assets in terms of loans and so on, but the liabilities are 34 trillion. So when you hear about the American federal debt, this is kind of what it really means. So 34 trillion in liabilities, 24.3 trillion in federal debt and payable interest, 12.8 in federal and veterans benefits. And the debt ceiling is where you get that business of increasing the deficit to meet the national debt ceiling. So here's my quick scorecard. At the end of the day, if I had to give it a scorecard, and then I'll give you a sea of data in a minute, I think the government demonstrated true Herculean efforts of mobilization. The markets will have proven to be quite resilient. And I think the society at the end of the day was as tolerant as it possibly could. That's my quick snapshot scorecard. So let's look at some economic data, some of the numbers. The US GDP in the last 20 years has shown, really steady growth. We're 28 trillion. The global GDP is 100 trillion, to give you some context. It's really about 809, but plus or minus numbers. Here's a nice snapshot of where all of this GDP comes from. 35 trillion from the Asian region, 30 trillion North America. North America is Canada, US, and Mexico. South America, 4 trillion, Africa, 3 trillion, etc. So Europe is 22 trillion in total world GDP. GDP growth rates, you can see here that the whipsaw of the depression, depression. These are depression numbers, but again, the sort of return to somewhat balance. The average GDP growth rate for the United States over the last several decades has been about 2.5 to 3%. So we're still, you can see that the consistency of the economy remains balanced and steady. Let's see, the GDP per capita. There's the GDP per capita. It's quite interesting when you study GDP per capita and you come to a country like China or wherever you want to go, and you can really kind of see GDP per capita and the living standards and the cost per purchasing power, all really quite played out, I think, well in a data point like GDP per capita. GDP from farm, agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. You can kind of see that it's it's mildly steady, if you will. I mean, I've given you many years here, but this is where it is as a landing point. GDP from construction. Here's the COVID era where it was kind of all over the place, and now it's on the rise again. GDP for manufacturing. Here's COVID. GDP for manufacturing is about 2.5 trillion of GDP, which I said was about 27 trillion. I'm sorry, yeah, 27 trillion. GDP from transportation and warehousing. You can kind of have fun with the numbers, but just taking a look at the graphs kind of help visualize sort of the state of the economy. GDP from government, 2.65 trillion. That continues to rise significantly. Here's some reflections on currency. The US dollar pegged to a basket of currencies. Basically, you can see here my little note to you tracks the value of the US dollar against a basket of world currencies. When the dollar is rising, the dollar is strengthening, meaning more buying power abroad and more expensive here in the US. So the dollar has been, like many currencies, within a sort of point, in this case, within a 10-point scale, but it still remains steady, a little downward peg since the last time I talked about this stuff. Just a couple of months ago, it was around 104, I think. Now it's 98.14. This was just taken, moments ago within the last day, I think. Bond prices are remaining relatively steadily growing. Bond prices decline when interest rates rise. We haven't had interest rates. Well, we had a surge in interest rates, the federal funds rate, for example, when the issuer experiences a negative credit event or as market liquidity drives up. So this government or this country is constantly trying to infuse liquidity into the market all the time. Here's the Dow Jones giving you kind of a COVID snapshot. I'm going to round numbers, but at about 5% general, and it's about 4.5% is the kind of average normal return, but over the stretch of time, the average return is around 14% over a longer period. So you can see the Dow Jones is always not up and down, but it's always volatile. You can see over here is when the Dow kind of was responding to a lot of the tariff discussions and all kinds of predictions. But there's been a nice sort of return, not a recovery, but there's just been a return to a steady benchmark. Everyone seems to pay attention to Tesla these days, whether they're, following the CEO or following just the interesting brand and story of Tesla. Tesla has, when all of the kind of Elon Musk stuff is going on, you can see his brand getting a bit hammered here. Excuse me, but general recovery from, if you look at June here and you look at, say, January-ish, when the new administration started, you can see that it's basically at par. Talking more about money, here's the money supply of the United States, 18 trillion. You can see that it was pretty mild until COVID, and then the infusion of monetary policy, particularly with quantitative easing. I'll just use that term broadly, 18 trillion. Here's M2 at 20 trillion. So this is just a staggering number that no one's ever seen before. I was just teaching the Chinese students here all of this just like a couple of days ago, and we were comparing China's the People's Bank of China, which is essentially the central bank, and how their M1 is very, very similar in terms of huge amounts of liquidity. The federal funds rate is the big main benchmark rate between interbank lending, but the sort of short version of it is, this is the benchmark rate that all banks gauge their decisions on where the starting point is for interest rates. So here's 4.33. Sometimes you can hear a lot of noise between the current administration and the current the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who, by the way, was a Trump appointee. And, he's always trying to push him to lower it. A bit of theater. The Federal Reserve chairman is completely independent. But there's the current rate for the last couple of months. This is an interesting snapshot of the massive amount of balance sheet holdings of assets and liabilities. You can see that the assets, when the Federal Reserve basically buys securities and puts them on its balance sheet, it pushes money into the economy. And at one point during COVID, it was as high as 8 trillion. This is like unprecedented numbers. It's usually below $1 trillion for its own entire existence. The good news is that it's now sort of offloading the toxic assets back into the market, and it's about 6.8 or so trillion. So you can see that it's moving down. Let's talk about trade. How are we doing, Ozza? We good? Don't yawn. It's 8 p.m. here, man, in China. All right, continuing. Trade. This is a picture of Los Angeles, just kind of at the tail end of COVID. All of these ships are parked out here. There were over 100 ships parked in the LA port. LA is where I live. And the LA port receives 40% of the world's trade into the United States. I have just kind of a fun little snapshot of what all of the boats look like in one moment during the day. Let me give you you can kind of read this with me, but let me just give you a quick kind of summary. Usually it's about $3,000 to bring a container from China to the United States. It went up to $18,000 and then back down to $3,000. So again, the resilience of the rate. For 6 months, 110 ships were anchored out there for 6 months. So down to 68 in 2022, less than 10 by 2023, and now there are 0. So there's the supply chain kind of realigning itself. This is just a kind of fun fact. I can give Stuart the slides if you'd like to have them. He can send them to you. But this is an interesting thing on how the ports make money. They make money by basically taking boxes off of boats and putting them on boats. I bet you didn't know this, but there's about 5,000 boxes on one boat, container ships. And that's a total move of 10,000 moves for one boat to come off and the containers to go on. And it's about $350 per container. So one shipping event is about $3.5 million in total revenue, just to give you a snapshot of that kind of size. What all of this says is really where the backlog of the American problem with COVID was not necessarily all of the ships in the ocean there in the harbor, but all of the inward inventory got completely chokehold, and yet it was able to kind of ease its way back into normalcy. Let's talk about trade. I know Stuart talked to you about trade and tariffs in previous discussion. I'm just going to show you kind of what we're looking at here. I think this is a really neat graph. From 1950 to late 70s, you have essentially a trade surplus. And then we have the opening of China. I don't want to blame China on everything, but the opening of China about 1983 is when things really get cooking. And you can see that the trade deficit just completely begins to tailspin, if you want to look at it as that. I mean, this is just a brilliant graph. You can see here's the COVID collapse, but about 65 billion per month is the trade deficit. Now it's receded a bit, and it's about 61 billion. Here's that shot. You can kind of see these are all deficit numbers. I'll come back to tariffs because I know you're just excited about tariffs. So here's kind of a neat little shot of crude oil production in terms of its growth. Consumed daily 18 million barrels in the US, EU, China 13 million. Daily production 11 million in Russia, Saudi Arabia 10 million, 5 million in China, 13 million barrels per day in production in the United States. Foreign direct investment continues to be, volatile, but generally upward sloping. 76 kind of. You can see that this is 76 billion in total foreign direct investment. Ultimately, all of the companies wanting to invest, build, sell into the U.S. market. U.S. exports by month. Again, the exports collapse in 2020. So upward kind of general sloping trend, 270 billion in US exports per month. Same kind of graph giving you the same presentation, but this is literally just as fresh as it gets. This is kind of neat if we kind of look at it, little wonky on the details, but exports of goods and services from the US rose 3% to 289 billion in April 2025, the highest on record. The data only goes to April in the particular index that we use. Goods exports increased 6.2 billion to 190.5 billion, driven by finished metal shapes, 8.1 billion. I'm giving you this because the details are kind of interesting. On the other hand, sales fell for crude oil, down 1.1 billion, passenger cars down 1.7 billion, etc. This is from what's called the US Census Bureau. It's not just counting people, but it also counts trade as well. This is kind of a neat shot of where exports by category, 3 trillion in exports. And ultimately, what do we export? Minerals, fuels, distillation products, machinery, and so on. You can see the big numbers here and then the tiny numbers as it goes on. US exports by country. Canada is our biggest customer, Mexico and China. US imports by category, electric equipment, machinery, nuclear. I guess we import a lot of nuclear reactors. I've seen about 4 nuclear power plants in this town that I'm in here, which is a small town of 15 million people. US imports by country. China continues to be right there. China, Canada, and Mexico. It's kind of a 3-way tie usually of who really sells into the US market. Tourism revenues continue to grow post-COVID. You can see the total near collapse of revenues in terms of tourism. There's a better look at tourist travel. You come in and then you leave. You come in and then you leave. So on the mend of tourist travel. US tourist arrivals, kind of a neat little shot. This is, some of you might be familiar with this, the Freightos Baltic Index. This is basically kind of a neat benchmark on how much it costs to send a freight or a container. It's a little higher than the model suggests. It's right now at $3,397 as of like 2 seconds ago. A neat look at our economic activity for the last 20 years. Generally, here's the 2008 crisis, volatility that's fairly steady, and then the COVID crisis, down 11%, and then a return, and then it's basically steady. So that's a very good snapshot. If you look at other countries, some of the South American economic activity is literally all over the place. I want you to pay close attention to this. This is the US exports and imports with China, and this is really giving you what a trade balance looks like. So in 2020, the US exported 124 billion to China and 432 billion incoming from China. So our trade deficit with one country alone was 308 billion. 2021 increased to 353 billion. 2022, 382 billion. And then you can see that it's mildly, quote, in decline. However, this is kind of a neat one. You can see that the world GDP and the world export with the United States and kind of get the whole world in a nutshell. So in 2024, the world GDP is 108 trillion. Exports of the United States are 2 trillion, imports 3.2 trillion. So the trade balance or trade deficit with the entire world is about 1.2 trillion. And you can see where it was in 1987. The GDP of the whole world was 17 trillion. The trade deficit was 152 billion. Here are some interesting comparisons. I want you to pay close attention to this. So you have China 2025 and China 2024. So January 2024, the balance is 23 billion. In January 2025, the trade deficit is 31 billion. And then you can kind of see that it gets a little tighter. April 2025, exports 8 billion. Look at the exports 1 year prior in April 2024, 11 billion. So this is the activity of the tariffs in real numbers. And here's an interesting one with Canada. You can see here that the trade in 2025 is 11 billion in deficit, and then in 2024 it's 6 billion. I did one with the UK just for Stuart and everybody else who's there. It looks like we're getting, I think, a little. So we have January 2025, 6 billion exports, and 6 billion imports. I think this is one of the first times that we've had quite interesting, quote, balance of trade. Trade with Mexico, you can kind of see the numbers. The trade deficit gets worse in January because everyone's, preparing for tariff shock. But what I'm suggesting to you that it's not as spectacular as the media may let on. We'll come back to that. So I have a comparison, quick snapshot comparison with China. But I want to see, Caesar, are you good? We all right?
Yes, I am. I am
Electricity
good.
I remember every time we'd have lecture, the electricity would kind of shudder a little bit.
Yeah.
Things are looking. All right, good. All right, let's do a quick rapid fire with China. Oh, I got to show you that because that's one of the greatest pictures of all time. Me standing literally in Wuhan. You can see this Wuhan and Evergrande in one sentence, one picture, and me standing literally at the beginning of COVID. And Stuart likes to say that I started COVID in the United States because I brought it back. That's me standing literally probably 2 blocks from the wet market.
And I also like the fact that it was the Evergrande School, the first significant construction company to go into to fail in China as well, Sean. So it's a double whammy.
So I had dinner with a very, very good friend, a former UCR MBA grad, and I said, "How's the economy in China?" He goes, "It's very bad." I said, "Really? Tell me about it." So he's telling me about it. He says, "I said, what about real estate?" He goes, "Wow, man, I own 5 houses. It's really, really bad." So I said, "Yes, you're not supposed to own 5 houses." All right, so here's the China's GDP steadily growing, but starting to show a little sign of pause, if you will. China's growth rate, guys, just remember that the Chinese growth rate for years was over 10%, and now it's sort of showing pressures of a maturing economy. Even my friend last night said, "Look, we've already built all of the rails, the streets, the buildings. There's nothing left to build, so we have to find new value-added production." China's GDP per capita, the good news is it seems to continue to rise steadily. Their bond rates are also a little lower than ours. Unemployment, this is quite interesting. Their unemployment has always been about 5% forever. So we don't have to do an analysis of it, but you'll always see about 5% unemployment, which really means 5%, 95% full employment aims and targets. China's inflation rate is quite interesting. We always want to see some inflation, but they're having a deflationary period right now, which is also meaning that the wages are down, prices are coming down modestly, but you can see that the chart, there's evidence of it. This is China's snapshot of the world, what China's imports by category. They're also importing electric equipment and so on. China's exports, they also export electric equipment, machinery, and so on. And then the countries, you can see that China's exports by country, US remains their best customer. Hong Kong, I suppose you can call that if it counts, but Hong Kong right across the street is their second best. Where's UK? Well, there's you now, 1.3% export to UAE. China's imports by country, 7.4% from the United States. China's CO2 emissions, this is quite an interesting comparison with the United States. And I think that's a kiloton of emissions. And then you have the US emissions, which is sizably different, lower. China's government budget deficit, I'm doing this as a comparative analysis to giant economies, and everyone, that's what you hear talking about all the time. Their budget deficit is expected to reach 6.4% of the country's GDP, which they kind of have. The US, by the way, is the same. It's basically the same in terms of comparison. Ours is about 6.2%. Let's go back to government. Government debt in the United States, 36 trillion, 129% debt to GDP ratio. I think you see the same kind of debt percentage ratios when you look at many of the Western countries as well. Government spending to GDP, 35% of GDP, which is pretty astoundingly high. And then this is an interesting snapshot of tariffs and trade imbalances. You have India, Brazil, and China and Russia kind of all really not participating in a quote balanced trade, but you have the other ones at par down below here. Again, I'm moving your faces all over so I can kind of see the whole screen. Country, European Union, China, India, and Brazil, you kind of see just sort of an interesting snapshot of the imbalance of trade. So here's just a quick assessment of tariffs. If you look at some of these are kind of famous in terms of how strict they are. There's always a benchmark. And if you go over, or a quota, and if you go over the quota, then you hit these crazy percentages here. So dairy products will charge American importers 300%. Chicken and turkey, 238%. Eggs, you know, if they don't want to buy, if they want to buy American eggs, it's going to cost 238%. And you can kind of get a quick snapshot that the rest of the stuff is generally 10% to 25%. By the way, the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, and Canada free trade agreement, ideally is meant to be zero tariffs. So never have any of the three countries met a free trade agreement. Something that you might also be interested in knowing is that the United States has a tiny handful of free trade agreements. It has agreements and memorandums of trade and understanding with trade. It does not have a free trade agreement with China, obviously, but a lot of times people think that there's free trade agreements all over the place, particularly with the US being the sort of quote biggest customer, and that's not the case at all. China charges a lot of tariffs on our imports, soybeans. We spend, I think, 50 billion in exports of soybeans. I probably had tofu last night from Nebraska soybeans, pork, beef, all of these kind of natural important imports for China from the United States, and they charge a hefty fine. However, again, I put however based on quotas. Now with sort of softening, kind of rattling around, they're on a pause, a cooling off, if you will, of around 10 to 15%. This is how a tariff really works. Country sets a tariff on a specific foreign good. When goods arrive at the border, a custom agency like the U.S. Customs and Border Protection calculates the tariff. The importing company pays the tariff, usually electronically, the government through customs authority. The government deposits the money as customs revenue in the national treasury. Importers may raise prices to cover the cost, making imports less competitive than domestic goods. Generally speaking, with the broader measure of inflation, which is very low, there has been really no broad evidence of increased prices. Whether that's going to be a lag or not, we shall see. Probably unlikely. I know Walmart said we're raising prices. But when you look at what they really raise, it's like a penny on suggested goods and services. But just keep in mind, Walmart's net income, its profit is so staggeringly low that it's something we can talk about in another seminar, but it's a really interesting thing to see how tight and on pricing Walmart is. So if they're going to raise the prices, we shall see. All right, so here's just a kind of estimation on how much total revenue, if you will, tariffs will bring into the U.S. Customs. It's estimated at the end of 2025, 100 billion. It's already within the last 6 months, 66 billion in tariff revenue. Quick on business bankruptcies. Everyone likes to talk about bankruptcies. Increased a bit, but it's always kind of a, you know, bankruptcies are interesting. They're important. They're also part of the kind of constructive destruction, if you will, of how businesses come and go in the US and elsewhere. Car production, these numbers are kind of interesting. It's usually about 11 million cars are produced in the United States. So the numbers you can kind of see down here, the US, about 11 million. China's just cranking out these cars like crazy. But again, much of their car production is for domestic consumption. And if you haven't been here in a while, literally every car looks exactly the same. It's the small SUV, BYD, and it's the same car. And they're great, but it's the same car. Mining production, this is when you are following, you know, when copper mining is up, that means technology is up. Corporate profits are continuing to be steady and inclining. Let's talk about the consumers. I'm almost getting to the finish line, by the way. Monthly prime lending rates. So this is pretty high and steep. 7 coming down a little bit, but about 7.5% is the prime lending rate, the lending rate for mortgages and sort of the best customer. China's loan prime rate is about 3.45. Consumer spending is continuing to be steady and strong, 16 trillion, and kind of steady. We have job growth, consumer spending, but also a lot of consumer debt. There's our debt load, pretty significant. I don't have a commentary on whether that's good or bad. I have a neutral view of credit card as a tool. I think it's one of the greatest inventions of all time in terms of access to short-term lending. However, there's, it's a two-way sword, if you will, but nevertheless, the credit card debt continues to grow. Gasoline prices are coming down mildly. Today in California, that's a little too steep right now. So the California is the highest priced gasoline in the country. Household debt to GDP decreased to 75% of GDP, includes consumers and mortgages. Household credit card debt, we kind of just showed you what that looks like in real money. Personal income, it's kind of an interesting one. Personal income has remained fairly steady and this is kind of one of the criticisms of, say, the last 30 years, that personal income remains generally flat. Savings rates are kind of coming down from the COVID craziness of 30% savings. Usually the US has a very low savings rate, roughly around 2%. And then finally, on housing, you can see mortgages. Here's how much it costs to buy a house in the US on average, is about, plus or minus 500,000, which is, very, very expensive, particularly in California. Here's new home sales in terms of adjusted per month, and these are annualized numbers. Building permits, when there's more building permits, there's more construction and production and so on. So little softening of building permits. Home sales are kind of a mixed bag, but existing home sales, you can see a lot of for sale signs kind of cropping up in the California space. New home building starts about 1.45 million on an annualized number. Inventory continues to kind of not, quote, meet demand. And finally, on prices, the inflation rate remains relatively low. Energy inflation remains relatively low. Export prices continue to maintain, I would say, stability. As well as import prices. Food inflation has come down. Producer price inflation, this is something that kind of measures the supply chain, cost of supply chain. Rent inflation is mildly coming down. We have our unemployment numbers that I've shared with you, roughly about 3.5%, which is pretty strong. You can see the spike of the COVID spike right there. And then this is always an interesting one to pay attention to. The labor participation rate has been coming down significantly in the UK and all of the Western countries for a lot of reasons. But mainly the big reason is that we have a lot of people who are getting older and a huge generation of just sort of retirees. Kind of comparing a UK snapshot there. And then you can see how many people are quitting. Our wage growth is very, very mild. This is a number that is, if it's above 50, there's growth. This is 4.95, so we want to see it above 50 in terms of global impact on global growth. All right, the finish line. Global growth, here's kind of the snapshot. In global GDP, 2019 was 87 trillion, 2020, 83 trillion. So the whole world lost nearly 4 trillion in GDP growth during COVID, and yet you can see the numbers have been resilient. What's the state of the nation, you ask? What's the future? Well, everyone in the United States seems to be getting older, fatter, and still living. So we need people to not die, but we need people to have more children and make sure that we can recognize that there are going to be people working well into their older years because they're still alive and they need something to do. So it's an interesting phenomenon. This is happening in many Western countries. We have a growing population. That's if you look at 2100, the year 2100. By the way, in the 1960s, President Johnson gave a famous speech and he said, by the end of this century, there'll be maybe 400 million people in the year 2000. So he was off a bit, but that's our projections as we look, 60 years out. This is just kind of fun to look at deaths and mortality and the population pyramid. It's a little better than I might have thought, but here is China. China's in trouble. China has way too many old people and too few young people. And then my final point, here's what our themes were. If you look at what the kind of world thinks of the United States, there's kind of this media economist perception of Trump kind of doing, this is, the time of Trump and all things Trump. That's really kind of just media perception. I've given you numbers that may certainly seem a little bit different. Never once mentioned his name. this is the reality, guys, that the US has a massive economy. Still, you know, if you look at this, 42% of stock markets, of value, you know, the 39 of the top 100 largest companies in the world. If you look at this, you can look at this is literally taken just a few seconds ago, the US stock market, and to put things into perspective, understanding market capitalization as the total value of companies and the people who work in the companies and the innovation that comes from the companies and so on. So this is something that is very, very important benchmark, and not just the economy, but why, say, a resilience is in the US economy. This is my favorite picture. I like to look at John Deere. Here's a great tractor of what America, you know, really is going on. People work, you know, their hearts out. They're working on farms still. You can see that the innovation's very, very strong. This is the last piece here. The state of the nation. It's a resilient economy, more stable and healthier than anticipated. Geographic momentum, economic growth is expanding beyond coastal hubs into the heartland and mid-sized cities. Media recalibration, a lot of shift in media tone is emerging, with some outlets offering more balanced narratives, highlighting both challenges and concrete signs of national progress. So I would be mindful that we remember what he had to say in terms of, you know, really, really understanding politics and economics, certainly of whatever country, but following the numbers and really what's going on, instead of sort of a media showcasing of what really any country looks like. Particularly if you're looking at China or the US, you literally have to go there and see the facts and the truth. So in conclusion, I think our markets are regionalizing. Political risk, though increasing, there's kind of a hegemony of the world still, that's nothing new. Economic risk increasing, but there's tons of liquidity. Costs are inflating while adjusting. The specialization of skills is quite evident. Acceleration of technology is crazier than ever. Society continues to transform in all of its interesting ways. The demographics are aging and changing. Our politics continue to harden. Our institutions, though, are sustaining. Economics continue to consolidate as well. And happiness is the pursuit of happiness. That's anyone else's game, but continues to evolve. If you're interested in not following me, but if you guys want to communicate with me, you can use that link, and that can give you some of my contact information if you'd like. And that concludes my presentation as sort of a waterfall of the numbers and really what's happening in the US and the state of the nation. So what is the state of the nation?
Well, thank you, Sean. I mean, I think that was a really, really insightful overview, and I like the fact that, you know, you did the comparative analysis between the United States and also China. Do you have any questions?
Yes, just a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned regionalization. In the Middle East, there is also, they call it localization. There are initiatives in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar, UAE. They're trying to encourage local production. By regionalization, do you mean that there will be more emphasis on local production? I know Trump is pushing that. And do you think there will be, that would help the economy grow a bit more? And how long do you think that will take in America?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. We see, no, I'm not just going to talk about, you know, Trump deals and come and build your factory here in the US, but that's kind of the broad macro vision of, okay, I mean, let me give you an example. We have a Vietnamese car company building cars in the United States. We don't have any Chinese car companies yet, but we see a lot of this. But it's not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly a politically, it's through the lens of politics that you see and hear that this is a new thing. I think it's an awareness phenomenon. And so, you know, is it going to change? Probably not in the next 6 months, but maybe over the next couple of years, you'll see a lot of investment, and I mean big investment in terms of production. Are we going to start making sneakers again? Probably not, nor probably should we. But higher value-added production, I think, is indeed, there's significant evidence that is the landscape of tomorrow. But as you said, it's not just the United States and UK. It's a kind of a necessary, and it's not decoupling. If you listen to maybe the Secretary of the Treasury, go look him up when he talks to Congress. He's a pretty smart guy. It's more strengthening partnerships, strengthening the balance of trade, and that kind of thing is really the flavor of what economics looks like right now. Rich?
I think Caesar had a question as well. So maybe Richard and then Caesar.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So And then I guess Stuart, you're also looped in, right, as to administrative stuff.
In what context, Richard?
My emails.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, but not prepared to discuss them on this in this call.
No. So with the cars, I did notice, I guess, something similar to maybe an Evergrande situation where there are different reports, I guess, of people owning several cars and being parked in random spots and just accumulating vehicles, electric vehicles. But in terms of, so I don't know if that's going to be another collapse in China, but in terms of what's happening in the United States, when we talk about military stability, I know we just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the Army yesterday. There were some nice ceremonies for that. But we do have some international conflicts. So how is it going to affect prices, inflation, debt, all of the above?
Well, it usually does. It usually, I mean, you saw the oil prices spike, but I mean, who knows? I'm giving you the data that's past to current, but I think it's predictive that through all of the stuff that we have experienced as a country, the country remains resilient. So can it handle 2 wars right now or 3? You know, I'm certain, I don't have any doubt that the conflicts that involve this country are going to be managed to the best of everyone's ability. But in terms of affecting economic activity and all of the data that I've shown you, I think that the country's stability is, I think there's a bit of confidence that we need to have, that particularly showing the numbers and response from a COVID recovery, different than other countries as well. So who knows what a war is going to do, but I think it's going to be okay. Caesar?
Yeah, and actually, just want to look. First, I want to thank you for this comprehensive data that you have presented. But I think the bottom line, you said it, that the large economics like US and China, they're resilient to such disruptive decisions and political, overnight decisions such as the tariffs. And so we were going crazy here to see what will be the impact of such, we spent 2-3 months watching what will happen with the tariffs, what is the decisions, what's going to be the big impact. And your numbers showed that, such markets are really, really resilient to any political disruptions as such done by President Trump. So, and still, the capitalization, as you presented, also the largest part of it is still in the US, and everybody is recently with the GCC countries, everybody is going to invest in the US. So I think the bottom line, your presentation presented that such political decisions are not going to be impactful on, large markets like the US and China. Neither minor wars. I think the largest war, which is Russia and Ukraine, which is Europe, again, not much of impact on the figures that you have showed. So which is really comforting. I mean, if we just want to think about the future of our kids. So I think you really put a lot of comfort that do not worry about such decisions, overnight decisions, whether wars or tariffs or whatever. These are minor details versus large markets as such. Do you agree?
It's interesting. Caesar, I think also what's interesting is, I mean, the tariff, I can talk about tariff strategy another time, but the tariff inflation, quote, has been nothing. Doesn't say it won't lag later, but here there's no evidence of inflation based on tariffs. Now the tariffs went 150% to 20. Now we can analyze Trump all day long. We can talk about strategy, but not now. But the point ultimately is I think what has happened is that a kind of deaf world has been rattled in a creative, destructive, pivoting way, for better and for worse. And the reality is that the numbers speak for themselves. The Congress has the capacity to be really, really checks and balancing as it's supposed to. You hear all of the theater in the Congress. And And then yet you have 50-50 votes and you have one person who can break a tie. So it's the institution persists. If I were giving anyone advice, read more, stay away from media, seriously, because it's all just kind of crap at the end of the day. And just read data. Even kind of the Financial Times is kind of coming into grips with a more neutral approach. I'm not suggesting that anything is sustainable, but just kind of read more as a scholar and stay off of the TikTok, even though I like TikTok. Stuart loves TikTok.
I would
And
like
you know,
to.
just one thing is that the AI make it very simple, you know, to get the data you want at any, you know, just at the tip.
Stuart, how's our time?
Fantastic. Okay, so I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous. So thank you to Dr. Famina Saeed for organizing this fascinating talk today. Thank you very much to Dr. Sean Jasso for giving up his Sunday evening in China. He'll be there for another week, so hopefully he'll arrive back without COVID and without the collapse of any construction companies. And also a huge thank you to everybody for taking the time out of your Sunday afternoons to join the call today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Take care.